Give me a countdown. Okay. We're here today. Well, just welcome, folks. We're here today. I'm honored to be able to do a very brief interview with the man I consider to be the 21st century's top constitutional scholar in America, Dr. Edwin Vieira Jr. And I want to very briefly discuss his scholarship, what he has published, and what his thoughts are regarding current events and how his scholarship relates to current events today in America. Edwin's most recent book, is this your
Yes.
martial law, most recent book?
That's the latest one.
Okay. Martial law book. Edwin's written a book regarding the imperial judiciary. By Tyranny Out of Necessity, book on martial law. And one very important book that I don't have with me, Pieces of Eight, 2-volume set, 1,700 pages, regarding constitutional money, history of it in America, abilities and disabilities, I believe, of money in America. Very important book that can fit in your jacket pocket, anybody's sport jacket pocket. 13 words, 122 pages on the first clause, first half of the Second Amendment. 2012, in CD form, The Sword and Sovereignty, 2,300 pages, 5,000 or 6,000 footnotes. Forget the
Probably, yeah.
endnotes and footnotes.
Endnotes.
So basically, Dr. Vieira is the top scholar on both the powers of the purse and the sword. And there's I believe, a multi-volume, a multi-disc set, Power of the Purse and the Power of the Sword. And several DVDs. This is from 2007, Principles of the Constitutional Militia, National Heritage Center for Constitutional Studies. And so this is a little bit of what Edwin has published. And so Edwin, could you, the Crash Maker, the novel,
Yeah.
Crash Maker,
Dealing with the Federal Reserve.
right, exactly.
Federal Reserve.
So could you briefly, Edwin, could you go through, beginning, I think, with the Crash Maker or Pieces of Eight, and you had some monographs on constitutional money back in the 90s also, some brief pamphlets. Could you briefly go through your publications?
Well, actually starts in 1983 with the first version of Pieces of Eight.
Okay.
And that was a spin-off, if you will, of the Gold Commission hearings that were held in the early 80s. Ron Paul was on that commission. They eventually proposed to Congress that the gold coinage should be reinstituted. That's where the present gold coinage came from, their determination in 82. And I had written something to them. The first version of Pieces of Eight was an extension of that. And then between that period, 1983, and say the turn of the century, I was writing quite a few monographs on monetary policy, the Federal Reserve, problems of world finance, if you will. Then at the turn of the 20th century, I wrote the extended version of Pieces of Eight, 2 volumes, 1,700 pages long. And I began working on, after 2001, I began working on the problem that most people call Homeland Security.
Right.
Focusing on this from a constitutional perspective, constitutional Homeland Security, what is that? And that is the militia of the several states,
Exactly.
which we don't have in this country in properly organized form. So I have been promoting that in terms of revitalization of that set of institutions. And in this latest book, by Tyranny Out of Necessity, which deals with the question of martial law, ties most of that together, because the martial law problem in this country will arise when the big financial crisis hits. And they're already planning for that. And the militia is the constitutional method for dealing with that problem, martial law. So it all ties together.
Yes.
Kind of one ball of legalistic wax. The difficulty is most of these things are not understood by the average person. If you talk to them about the Federal Reserve, well, their eyes glaze over. Financial and banking issues, that's something that the average person doesn't know anything about. Most legislators don't either because they believe it's an issue that should be handled by the Federal Reserve or the United States Treasury, not the state legislatures. And since 1983, the first edition piece of aid, I have been trying to educate them at the state legislative level.
Yes.
That they need to do something to develop an alternative currency, an alternative monetary system at that level in anticipation of a breakdown of the Federal Reserve. I haven't had a great deal of success with that, personally, but just recently that idea was picked up in the state of Texas, and they created a state gold and silver depository which will function as essentially a state gold and silver bank where people can deposit their gold and silver and then transfer it among themselves, payment of contracts or other debts and so forth and so on.
So that recent law passed in Texas is a very good thing.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
Now, the reason they did that was because Texas has very large amounts of gold in two of their state pension funds. So they were concerned with having that gold in Texas and having it under their direct control. And whoever wrote that legislation, actually it's Rhode Island, we transplanted to Rhode Island, the man who wrote that legislation apparently saw that once we have this institution set up as a depository, we can also use it for this other purpose, for the banking function. So this will be the first institution of its kind at the state level that is capable of performing that function. And that will give people in Texas, and actually others can use it, it's not limited to people in Texas who can use it, that will give those people the opportunity essentially to walk around the Federal Reserve System and use an alternative currency, gold or silver, in preference to Federal Reserve currency.
So that could be a template that other states could use.
Oh, I think exactly.
Sort of break into the restoring constitutional money
Exactly. System. Giving other people in the United States the same opportunity to use an alternative currency. And when you have a breakdown of a major financial system, that's the safety belt, or the safety, the life preserver, is the ability to go to an alternative currency while the original currency is melting down.
Do you think other states or other people from outside of Texas will want to deposit their bullion in that depository?
I think as soon as they find out about it, because it enables them not simply to have the bullion held in safe storage, but to use it as actual currency. That's the problem now. People can obtain gold and silver, and people can make gold and silver contracts. Nothing illegal about that.
Right.
You can opt out of the Federal Reserve System to that extent, but you have no institutional structure to do this at long range. Right? If I make a contract, you and I here in New Hampshire, well, we may fulfill it personally. But what if we're in different states? What if we're halfway across the country? What are the institutional structures that enable us to do that? Well, they don't exist because the Federal Reserve System will not allow the banks within that structure to set up these kinds of accounts.
So regarding the gold and silver contracts, like I'm retired from big city construction projects. I used to work as a carpenter, foreman, superintendent. And I was well aware of what's called a labor agreement between the Contractors Association and the unions. Now that's a private contract. And then there's also, of course, the general contractors use an architect's, I think it's an AIA 201 document. It's used a basic construction contract. So there would be between owners and contractors, they have a private contract. So could those groups, as e.g., for example, construction contracts, for where I came from in my earlier career, between owners and contractors and architects, and also between contractors, associations, and unions, could they insert that clause in those clauses in those contracts?
Well, in principle, there'd be no problem unless they have some governmental regulation that would set the terms of those contracts. The ability to make a contract to be paid in gold and silver, to the exclusion of Federal Reserve notes, Federal Reserve notes will not be used, is secured by congressional statute. There's actually a statute that allows this. And at the state level, it's pretty much essentially what contract you want to make. The state courts will enforce it. Now the difficulty is, another thing I've been trying to do going around the country, is to convince state legislators to pass specific statutes dealing with gold cross contracts. For two reasons. Number one, Congress could repeal the statute that it has now.
Right.
And then you'd want to have something at the state level
right.
as an insurance policy. And secondly, most state judges, in my estimation, have never seen these kinds of contracts. So if a contract had to be enforced, it's conceivable that they might give a judgment payable in Federal Reserve notes, which is not the way those contracts should be enforced. The Supreme Court ruled on this after the Civil War. There were a lot of these contracts made all the way through up until 1933. So it's a specific set of rules as to how those kinds of contracts were supposed to be enforced. But I think the general tenor of lawyers and judges these days is they know essentially zero about that history. So what you want to do at the state level is have a state statute that tells the judges, when you see one of these kinds of contracts, here's how it has to be enforced. And that then makes that contract much more secure, because you know that if you have to go into court to enforce it, it's not going to be paid in Federal Reserve notes, it's going to be paid in the gold and silver for which you originally contracted.
So people who are afraid of devaluation of the dollar,
Inflation, what they call inflation.
they would naturally want to become more interested in another option where they would be protected
That's right.
in contracts.
And I would anticipate that as things become shakier for the Federal Reserve, more and more people who can make those kinds of contracts themselves
Yes.
will take some percentage of the contracts they make and put gold clauses or silver clauses in them. And then as the Federal Reserve continues to melt down, that percentage will increase and increase and increase. And the one thing that would hold that back is, well, there's no institution that enables you to deposit your gold and silver, that transfers the gold and silver from one account. You can't write checks. Right? You don't have debit cards. Well, this Texas depository is the beginning of a change in that area. Now you have the institution, that ability will be there, and that will make it that much easier to write a gold close contract, because now you know how it's going to be enforced, you know how it's going to be usable, and the more people that have access to that kind of an institution, the more these contracts will be made.
Okay, that falls under the phrase, the old ancient phrase, power of the purse. So let's match that up with the power of the sword. But before we get into your publications on that and current events and so forth, for the average person, we just had a little bit about constitutional money and the value of it. Why is the power of the sword important to also the power of the purse? And I know you did a DVD and a seminar on that. So how can the average person watching this connect the power of the sword to, or the constitutional security and constitutional enforcement, connect that to the purse?
Well, historically, political science, the two great powers of government were the power of the purse and the power of the sword.
Right.
The power over money, taxation, spending, and so forth. And the power of the sword was the military or the quasi-military, the police function.
Yes.
Now, if you look at the problems that we have today, they stem from the failure of the government in Washington, D.C., and to a certain extent the government of the states, to exercise the power of the purse correctly. Transferred huge amounts of authority to the Federal Reserve System and the private banks within that system. And we're seeing the consequences of a faulty banking and currency system. That's the economic consequence, but there will be a social consequence. You have economic breakdown, financial breakdown, banking breakdown, social dislocation follows. You have people in the streets.
Security issue.
Security issue. And we see that the government, at least in Washington, D.C., through the Department of Homeland Security, I think, is foreseeing this. That's the militarization that's going on from the Department of Homeland Security at the top of the pyramid down to these local and state police agencies.
We've seen a little of this breakdown in Ferguson, Missouri, Baltimore, Maryland.
You saw it with the Boston Marathon. They put 10,000 of these paramilitary people on the streets in one day.
Watertown, Massachusetts.
They Watertown, Massachusetts. Now, they didn't plan for that morning.
No.
They were organized for this, and I don't think they were anticipating that particular event. They were organized for any type of serious social dislocation. And I think the one that they have in the forefront of their minds is what happens when the Federal Reserve System really goes into meltdown. What will be the consequences of that? And it will occur in the streets, basically, especially in the urban areas. So, if you look at the Constitution of the United States, looking at that issue, we're dealing with what could be called a security issue. Well, where is the only place in the Constitution of the United States where the word security appears? It's the first 13 words of the Second Amendment. Well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. Notice that. The security of a free state, not a police state, not a totalitarian state, security of a free state. And it's a well-regulated militia. Well, what is that? Well, a well-regulated militia, and I've written a number of books on that subject, is the total organization of the population within actually each locality and then within the state. It's organized on the basis of ultimately the state statute. And it provides, at the present time, for essentially any kind of security you can imagine. So you would have a quasi-military security, which is the police, the emergency management people, the fire people. You'd have economic security, which would go to something like the Texas Depository. We made sure that within your state there was an alternative currency that would protect you against financial dislocations. You can imagine a whole series of what I would call social welfare functions that can be performed through the militia because they are local institutions. Essentially, there's no limit to this. Honest elections, conduct honest elections through the militia. Make sure that only registered voters vote and that the votes are counted correctly and tabulated correctly.
Legal aliens with driver's licenses and
well, whatever it would be.
Yeah, right.
But who would be more capable of accomplishing that than the local people in that locality, in those little electoral districts? And if they were organized in a militia structure, that would be one of the functions they'd perform.
Virginia Constitution, Declaration of Rights, Section 13. A well-regulated militia composed of the body of the people
trained to arms. The body of the people trained to arms. It's an organizational concept and a training concept. It's not simply that you're a member of some group and that's it. You have membership, the things you have to perform. There's a civic duty involved in this. Well, tying it back to the martial law concept.
Yes.
Most people say, well, we have to have some kind of martial law situation because we may need to put troops in the streets if we have riots, if we have these kinds of social disturbances, civil disturbances. Well, if you look at the Constitution, there is no martial law provision. Those terms don't appear in the Constitution. If you look in the Declaration of Independence, the attempt by King George III to impose martial law in the colonies was considered one of the tyrannical abuses that justified independence. So you'd say, well, immediately there has to be a tremendous bias against the concept of martial law in our system. It's not in the Constitution. It was challenged and excoriated in the Declaration of Independence. But we might need it. But the answer is the Founding Fathers were not children. They foresaw these problems.
Yes.
And they put into Article 1 of the Constitution the power of Congress to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union. Now, if you think about what martial law is, in general, it's a martial institution, an institution that has some kind of paramilitary organization and training, executing a body of laws. And there it is in the Constitution. The militia to be called forth, that's the paramilitary organization, to execute the laws of the Union, so we specify what laws they are, and what is the supreme law of the Union? The Constitution.
Yes.
So you would not have a situation where you would have police or military forces executing some kind of military law. It would be the militia, the local people themselves, executing our regular civil laws with respect for the Constitution. So you wouldn't have these Fourth Amendment problems, Fifth Amendment problems, search and seizure problems, all the rest, seizure of guns. You think of all these things that come into your mind when the paradigm martial law appears, right? Katrina, where they were going around breaking into homes to seize guns from people. That wouldn't happen under the concept of martial law that was based upon the militia executing the laws of the Union and executing the Constitution, number one. But we don't have that structure here, not since 1903. And my point to people is, we are on the edge of some very serious events that will cause us to need that kind of an institution. I mean, we need it in principle because the Constitution says so, but we're certainly going to need it in practice in the immediate future. So job number one, I would say job number one is probably the Texas Depository type situation. Get that alternative currency in place so that we, as much as possible, prevent or mitigate the financial breakdown. But then very closely aligned to that, job number two is revitalize the militia, because what happens if the financial breakdown comes and we're not prepared to deal with the unrest in the streets?
So the Section 13 of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, Virginia Constitution, body of the people, so that would be between a minimum age and a maximum age of able body of the people. Would that mean the able-bodied people?
The body of the people meant essentially everybody who could perform that function.
Okay.
And in the colonial period and the period immediately thereafter, it was from about 15 to 16 years. When they became emotionally mature, physically mature, they became capable of doing it. up to what, 50, 55, 60 years of age, because at that age, in those times, people had eye problems, hearing problems, they had rheumatism, arthritis, other kinds of diseases that couldn't be cured. They couldn't perform the function.
Right.
If they could have performed the function, and some of them did because they were officers at that age, right? These were the guys riding the horses, they weren't the ones standing and fighting in the field. Then they would, of course, maintain their militia position. But people weren't required after a certain age. But everyone in society had some function to perform, even the conscientious objectors. They weren't required to carry guns or train militarily, but there were other things that they did.
So they would be ready, when called, to enforce the Constitution, the supreme law, and be ready for any emergency.
That's right.
Okay. So you mentioned the first step would the money issue, because the banking system, the status of that right now. So,
and we can do that very quickly.
yeah.
That's a matter of passing a statute and then building up a little bit of infrastructure. And then it's there. It's working.
So today, if you're very briefly suggesting to what can people do right now, including legislators, but the average person, I would think the 13 words is a very easy read. They can start here, or they can News with Views.
Newswithviews.com.
We have free short commentaries.
That's right. A whole series of them on these particular subjects.
What is the necessity, very briefly, the necessity to wrap up, the necessity, and I'm going to mention that your books are all available on Amazon. What is the immediate necessity and the importance that legislators and the people get involved? What is that necessity on the micro level? What is that necessity to the macro level of America in general and America's near future?
Well, on the micro level, the necessity is protecting your own locality against the effects of financial breakdown and then the social and economic effects that follow from that. You have to get that under control. You have to get your home base under control. And then you build up, as it were, in the federal pyramid all the way up to Washington, D.C. Now, Washington, D.C. may be a long shot, right, because we have difficulty. So we want to do as much as possible at the local level, and that is going to require the state government coming into play for some of these things, certainly the state depository, the state militia. So first people have to educate themselves in the necessity for this. They have to look at where we are and, in a sense, the train wreck that's approaching us on the tracks. Give them themselves a certain amount of education with a book like this.
Yes.
It's pretty simple.
Yep.
Contact some of their own neighbors and friends. Start talking about this. Everyone has a local legislator, as a representative or a state senator. Try to get him online, get him at a meeting of people and say, this is something you need to think about.
Mention Texas.
And then point out, well, now this has already been done. This is not something that is pie in the sky.
Right.
It's already been done in Texas.
So that's Edwin. It's been a pleasure to have you, and this is very for viewers. This is very, very important material, right from the top scholar in America, as I see it today, with his various publications that impossible to rebut, to refute. And when I go to Amazon and I'll look up one of these books, like I need to buy Three Rights, which is another book Edwin has written. When I go to that page on Amazon.com to purchase that book, there'll be a picture of the covers of all his other books.
Yeah, they're all together. You find one, you find
So
them all.
you go to one book, it'll list all his other books that he's published, and I recommend 13 Words. I recommend going to newswithviews.com, to his archive there, going all the way back to 2005.
Oh yes. And if they simply put me into one of the big search engines, they'll find a lot of other YouTube features or snippets or whatever that I've given. In fact, just to finish this up on the monetary side, I gave one to representative staffers of House Congress representatives on the history of money, which is essentially a synopsis of that 1,700-page book, Pieces of Eight.
Right.
And this one goes on for about an hour and a half presentation. That's pretty easy to find. Just put my name in, House of Representatives address on money. It comes right up, very professionally done by the people there. And that gives anyone who really has no background in this at all, if they listen to that presentation, they'll see how it all developed.
So there you are, folks. From the top scholar, and one of the top scholars in America, as some other peoples would say. Get on Amazon, buy a book by Edwin, go to News with Views, especially all you patriots, Second Amendment lovers in America. Thank you, Edwin, very much. It was a pleasure to have you.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much.